Well, good evening, everyone. I believe everything is up and going at this particular moment. I'm going to try and see if I can do what I did last week. Make sure I've got the stream up on my phone so I can kind of um, follow how it's going and kind of keep. There we go. Yeah, it's up and going. Keep tabs on making sure everything is working properly. So tonight we pick up where we left off last week. We have the Gospel of Matthew kind of in front of us for the next little bit, and I'm going to be working my way through kind of section by section and trying to help unpack how Matthew writes and how that influences our reading the Gospel, what his points were, and how his own setting and culture shapes the Gospel that we have now. And I think by understanding the setting from which we get these writings, by understanding the cultural push and pull that he lived in, we better understand the gospel as we have it. So last week we looked at the genealogy of Jesus, a passage that we tend to skip over. We don't pay a whole lot of attention to the genealogy. Genealogies don't usually get focused on much. And if we do them, it's for a memory verse for Sunday school, so that we can say that we've done it. Matthew, of course, as I pointed out last week, writes a very different genealogy than Luke does. There are some different points to be made, and he kind of continues that on this week, where he writes a different birth story of Jesus than what Luke gives us. And I think, much like I pointed out with the genealogies last week, that paying attention to the differences helps us understand the points that are being made and the ideas that they're trying to get across. Those points, those details that are shared and those that are not, tell us a little bit about the audience, the message, and what is going on in the world around them. And so tonight, I like Matt. We spend a whole lot of time, especially around Christmas, taking a look at Luke's birth story because it gives us more details. It gives us more information. That's where we get Mary going to visit Elizabeth, who's pregnant with John, and John jumping in the womb. Matthew doesn't give us quite as much to work with on Mary. Gives us more on Joseph. And, oh, cool, my phone just let me know that the Rangers beat the Phillies. So, hey, there we go. Gives us more on Joseph, gives us the flight to Egypt and kind of those bits and pieces of the story, all of which are very important to Matthew's gospel. So, this week we pick up in verse 18 of chapter 1, though we are going to take the time tonight to take a look at a passage out of Isaiah 7 and another out of Deuteronomy 22. So if you're the type of person who wants to have like passages ready to go, then I would suggest that you go ahead and slip a piece of paper or stick a finger or a bookmark in Isaiah 7 and Deuteronomy 22 so that we can kind of roll right through these when we get there. I will also have them, I think, on the screen. So if you want to just follow along what I've got up, then that will be perfectly fine as well. All right, so again, we get Matthew's declaration of the beginning of Jesus. So chapter 1, verse 1 begins with the genesis of Jesus the Messiah. And then verse 18, again, says basically the same thing. Here is a Genesis story. Matthew, of course, being well-versed in the Torah, in his Bible, I don't think leans for that or reaches for that word and that image accidentally. And so here I'm just going to start by reading the passage that we're looking at tonight before we spend the time kind of unpacking it. Now, the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All of this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne him a son, and he named him Jesus. All right, so I want to start by giving you some information about marriage practices in first century Judaism, because there are some pieces of this story that I think make more sense once we know how marriage and engagement in the first century worked. So very obviously it does not work as the same in our world. So in the first century, marriages were arranged. This is one of those moments that I'm very thankful that I do not live in the first century world. Not that I don't trust my parents' ability to do some picking if they end up watching this video later, but I thoroughly enjoy having a say in how, big decisions in my life go. Mostly the marriages were arranged by families. In wealthier families or in bigger places, larger cities, you might engage like a professional matchmaker, but for the most part, they were arranged by families. And I think sometimes we get the idea, or at least there have been moments where I've heard repeated the idea, that marriages were like arranged at birth, and that's not even remotely close to true. Infant mortality rate in the ancient world was quite high. One of the reasons the practice comes about that you don't name your child for the first several days is because you don't actually know if that child is going to make it or not, and you don't want to assign important family names to the firstborn if they're not going to count as your firstborn based on how ancient practices went along those lines. And so you would wait until the kids were becoming of age. The information that I've got comes from a couple of centuries after Jesus as far as what those ages were, but go ahead and find it safe to assume that it likely didn't change that much in the couple hundred years there. Usually that betrothal would take place around the age of 12. Could not take place until the age of 12 for girls and 13 for boys. Very often, though, the actual age of engagement for girls was about that age, and for husbands was often a little bit older to provide them some time to get established and get ready. One of the things that happens when a husband took a wife in the ancient world was you also took on her property, anything that she had with her. So when bride prices were paid, those monies often went to help establish the family, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, on a slide here in a minute. Engagement was a legal process. Like, whenever an engagement was arranged, the bride price would be paid. There was a contract that would be signed, and the husband would then begin the process of adding on a room for he and his bride to be to his family's home. And the marriage could not take place until that room was finished. And so, if the husband-to-be is like on year 7 of building the room, maybe you know that he's not all that interested in the relationship. There were procedures for breaking off engagements. That was part of the process, but it was very much a procedure. To break an engagement was to initiate a divorce. It was not as simple as deciding, I don't think I want to do this. At this point, money had changed hands, expectations were set, and so it took legal maneuver in order to end an engagement. The wedding ceremony took place usually at least a year after the engagement itself. It could sometimes take more, like I said, if they take some time to get established in the family business, or if adding on the room does not come quickly, then it took a little bit longer. And then the wedding ceremony itself, when it happened, was really a parade. It ended up being a giant city party, essentially. Especially villages, this would occupy the entire village. And so whenever they run out of wine at the wedding in Cana in John 2, and people are worried about it being a big deal, it's because you had a lot of cultural and social currency attached to being able to throw a party for the community. And the longer that party went, the greater your honor, which was very much a social currency in the ancient world, the greater it was. And so if you were well known and well respected, but your party begins losing steam a little early, that can cost you. So Jesus is not just, providing really good wine at the tail end of a party. He is buying that family some cultural currency and saving them some shame. So the way that a wedding in the Jewish culture would work is the community, and again, another one of those moments where I'm very happy that our world is a little bit different. The community would essentially parade the bride from her family's house to her husband's house. And then everybody would kind of wait around outside the family home while the marriage was consummated. And then the party would, begin at that point, or kind of continue. That was how the ceremony went. The other thing I'll add is, for a lot of poor families in the ancient world, there was no marriage by the way that we imagine it. There was no legal contract. There was no big party. Families that could not afford it simply bypassed the marriage process and moved in together and were considered married. In our world, I think in the U.S. we would call those common law or something along those lines. In the ancient world, that was pretty par for the course. If you didn't have the money to be able to throw a massive community party, or your family could not pay the bride price, but you couldn't let family lines end, and your family was also not the only one in those tight spots. So that's another way that marriages took place in the first century, but that's a little bit of a sidetrack on where I want to go. Joseph and Mary give us an interesting situation. Mary's pregnancy is definitely a curveball, though the book of Deuteronomy provides a legal outline for what can and by law should happen when a bride turns up pregnant not by her husband. And so, let's see if I do this right. Okay, cool. So I'm actually going to come back. I'll go ahead and share the quote. Just keep the quote in mind as we kind of read through the next few verses. I kind of put those in the wrong order, but this is from an article on marriage in the Dictionary of New Testament Backgrounds. By preparing to divorce Mary privately rather than take her before the judges, Joseph may have forfeited his legal right to impound allegedly unfaithful fiance's dowry in order to avoid her humiliation. And that tells us something about Joseph, who feels wronged in this situation. Before he gets, divine information that changes his direction of thinking, he is confronted with a woman he knows he hasn't slept with being pregnant, and he's engaged to her, and what do you do with that? And Joseph has some options for how he can act, which we're about to read through, but he chooses this one. So, if a man is caught lying with the wife of another man, and remember we're talking about a situation where engagement equals marriage, if a man is caught lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman as well as the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. If there is a young woman, a virgin already engaged to be married, and a man meets with her in town and lies with her, you shall bring both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she did not cry out for help in the town, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge evil from your midst. But if the man meets the engaged woman in the open country, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. You shall do nothing to the young woman. The young woman has not committed an offense punishable by death, because this case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. Since he found her in the open country, the engaged woman may have cried for help, but there was no one to rescue her. If a man meets a virgin who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are caught in the act, the man who lied with her shall give 50 shekels of silver to the young woman's father, and she shall become his wife. Because he violated her, he shall not be permitted to divorce her as long as he lives. So again, reading through those laws, very happy that I live in the world that I live in and not theirs. Just to be clear, what that just said is if a man rapes a woman, he has to buy her from her dad. I'm not a huge fan of that law. I do love, at least, that there was some wiggle room for she was in a situation where she could have cried for help and couldn't have received help because she was being raped, so let's not hold that against her. But this is the law that is in play for the Jewish people like Joseph, who finds out that his bride-to-be is pregnant and he's not the responsible party. And so the law sets us up for this situation where what Joseph can do, and what the law here, by emphatically saying, "So you shall purge the evil from your midst," encourages them to do, is to put his bride to death. And so, what Joseph does here, by not considering that route, or at least by not choosing that route, where his first reaction before the visit from the voice of God is to find a way to do this with as little fallout for Mary as possible, I think is incredibly admirable and tells us something about Joseph. Because that decision, putting her away quietly, returning the bride price and just letting it all disappear, costs Joseph something in a way that publicly humiliating her would not have. And so he's willing to take a hit in order to protect Mary, his bride-to-be. And I don't think we often pay attention to that piece of the story, but that's very much, I think, what is going on in Joseph's mind when he makes his decision to act quietly, because that means he has other options on the table that he is not choosing. And this is the point that I want to make. I've got it up on the screen. I'm going to read it word for word. There's a way to read this story itself that itself sets the tone for the gospel. We see Joseph sacrifice and go against the letter of the law in order to protect the unfaithful Mary, thereby embodying the type of sacrificial love that Jesus is going to teach. Matthew does not write anything accidentally. He chooses to tell the stories that he tells for a purpose. He chooses to tell them the way he tells them for a purpose. He's not simply relaying information. He is using his paper he's using the paper he's writing on to set a tone for genuine discipleship. And I think we have to see Mary and Joseph both in that line. Joseph makes a choice that he is willing to take a hit personally in order to protect somebody who, before he makes that decision, he could say has not protected him, has not been faithful, has not held up her end of the responsibility. If that wasn't important information for Matthew to share, if he doesn't see a discipleship point to be made, he doesn't share the story. So I want to make sure we get that, because it's often something we miss when we read through here. Okay, and then I've got this titled That Isaiah Passage. So let's deal with that Isaiah passage. Isaiah 7 is where Matthew pulls the quote about the virgin shall give birth. And I want to read the larger context and the actual translation, because Matthew doesn't quote it word for word, and he makes some choices in the process, and I want to be sure that we take that into account, because I think it affects how we read the Gospel of Matthew, and I think it may help walk through what is a little bit challenging of a passage that Matthew chooses to quote. So here's the Isaiah passage. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, "Ask for a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." So at this point, Judah, Jerusalem is in a tight spot. Things are not looking good. It's the Syro-Ephraimitic war. Things are not going well for Ahaz. He's trying to pull help from elsewhere, and Isaiah is trying to encourage him to rely on God. And Isaiah tells Ahaz to ask for a sign. Ahaz responds, verse 12, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test," which sounds pious, but really isn't. When God is telling you to ask for a sign, ask for a sign. Ahaz is not one of Judah's great kings, and we see here again why not. Continuing on, verse 13. Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David." And if you are paying attention to the Gospel of Matthew, you understand that that phrase, house of David, carries some meaning to it. "Is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child, and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose 2 kings you are in dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on your ancestral house such days as have not come, since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. So, few points that I want to make sure that you understand here. First, Isaiah is making a specific prophecy to King Ahaz about the coming end of the Syro-Ephraimite war. That's what this is about. And so the way that I imagine this taking place is that Isaiah is standing in King Ahaz's court. They're having this conversation. Ahaz is being a bit cagey. Isaiah finally says, here, absolutely enough of that. You see that young woman over there that is pregnant. And in the Hebrew, it is very obvious that she is already pregnant. The Greek translation of the Hebrew is where things get a little fishy. But she is already pregnant, and by the time the child she is pregnant with is old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, and is capable of eating somewhat solid food, this problem will be over and things are going great. Now, there are a few points worth considering. The Hebrew word here is alma, which does not mean virgin. It means young woman of marriageable age. Whether or not she's married already or not, it's the word used for a woman in a specific age bracket. It has nothing to do with her status as a virgin or not. She could be married, she could be not married, but it's somebody who's in that age bracket. The other thing is, it's also fairly obvious in the Hebrew that she's already pregnant. It's not about a future pregnancy. It is very much about something that is already happening. And then the third thing is, this is a sign for Ahaz. Isaiah is not making a prediction about something that's going to happen 800 years later, because something happening 800 years later means absolutely nothing to Ahaz, right? He is very concerned about what's going on right then and right there, and Isaiah says this is a sign for you. This is a sign for you, Ahaz. This is a sign for this court. This is a sign for your circle of advisors who are with it in earshot right now, and this is a sign for the people. God is already at work. So all of those things are going on here. So when Matthew quotes, he doesn't quote, he mostly becomes close. And he also chooses to follow the Greek translation, which would have been, fairly available in the first century world that he lived in, of virgin. He's doing something that is disconnected in a very historic sense from Isaiah's prophecy, but he's using Isaiah's words to do it. And I remember the first time I really sat down and read through the Isaiah passage, and I had that realization of Isaiah's talking to an actual person about an actual thing that he's actually going to see. And so that provides then some questions about what Matthew is doing when he reaches 800 years back for this prophecy that very much meant something to its first hearers that they were not going to be able to wait 800 years for. So what do we do with that? And I think we have to recognize that there are a few different ways people have chosen to read it. One of the ways that it's been chosen to read is as if Isaiah is making an 800 years down the road prediction. That's one of the ways that you can read it. People have read it. I don't think the context allows for that. The second way that you can read it is that Isaiah is making this prophecy, but many prophecies, so the view goes, have a double fulfillment. So it was true in that way, and now it's ultimately fulfilled in this way. And then I think there's a third way, which is kind of where I'm sitting right now. I'm not saying I've got all this figured out, so please don't take this as the ultimate answer. But I think using Matthew's understanding of the Old Testament and how he presented the genealogy that we looked at last week gives us an idea of how Matthew reads his Bible, is what we call the Old Testament, was the only testament he had at that point, how he reads that in light of Jesus. Matthew, as I pointed out last week, does not give us a perfect or even literal genealogy. Amos and Asaph and missing generations in comparison to Luke's genealogy tell us that. Matthew was not going for a perfect rendition. Instead, he's giving us a thematic genealogy, one that points us to bigger ideas, broader ideas out of Old Testament images and types, where we begin to where Matthew encourages us to see Jesus and the people around him in light of these very important Old Testament figures. So it's one way of Matthew saying, okay, do you remember that guy Moses? Here's Jesus. And here's some similarities. Do you remember that guy Joseph, who, had to go through Egypt and saw visions? Well, here's Jesus's father Joseph, who has some of those same experiences. So what I think is going on, and I think this holds as we read through all of the other fulfillment passages in Matthew's gospel. I don't think Matthew thinks that Isaiah was making a prediction to King Ahaz about Jesus. Instead, I think that Matthew is reading his scripture, and he sees this conversation between Isaiah and Ahaz about a child whose presence points to the coming rescue of God. And then, as he's telling the birth story of Jesus, he points to that conversation and says, like that. I don't think fulfillment means just in the way that we often view it in modern world. So fulfillment, when I think of it right now in our world, I think of Amazon fulfilling my order. I have put in an order, they stick it in a box, and they mail it to me. It's this, and now it's filled. But I don't think that's a great way to view the ancient idea of fulfillment around Matthew's reading of the Old Testament. Instead, I think a good way to read that is bringing it to life. What was then, Matthew says, or Matthew thinks, can only be known at a distance, but in Jesus, it is known and present in front of you. And I think that is a good way to understand what Matthew is doing and how Matthew reads his Bible and how Matthew reads Jesus in light of his Bible. And so we get, as we close out this kind of first section, this first chapter, an image of a child born that is a forerunner to the rescue of God. A fulfillment of God's ongoing promise to be with the people, to guide and lead them, and to ultimately rescue them. And while Matthew does not yet say that this is the ultimate rescue, Matthew is already pointing us to understand that the goodness of God is going to show up in a powerful way while this born child, Jesus, is still alive. And the other thing that does is remind us that Jesus' life matters beyond just the death and resurrection. But all of that stuff between has some meaning too. Okay, I apparently had a slide for that, and I shot it all from memory. So, I'll leave that on the screen so you can do a red version that's a lot more concise and probably better thought out than what just came out of my mouth. I like that. Instead, it reminds us that God is working amongst all humanity and expects humanity to participate in God's work. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's work and humanity's participation therein, because Jesus is both God and man, right? And so Matthew collects these stories of Jesus in a way that shows us what true discipleship is. That's what I should have said the first time. So, in short, in closing, Jesus is the heart and way of God. In Jesus, the heart and way of God is ultimately revealed. Go and do likewise. I think that serves as a good introduction that Matthew gives us in the gospel here. You've probably heard me say this a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different times now. I don't think a flat literal reading of Scripture is very healthy or helpful. There's some really dangerous ways to read passages literally. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take Scripture at face value, but I do think it's important for us to recognize that the gap between our world and the first century world is pretty significant. And by the time we actually sit down with the text that we have in front of us, it has gone through plenty of other people's interpretations to get to us. Like at some point, a Greek translator read the Hebrew word Alma, which never means virgin in the Old Testament, and decided that the Greek word best suited to translate that is the word virgin. They made a choice, and that obviously influences how things go. By the time we get the Bible, we are getting other people's interpretations of ideas. So what I want to make sure that we are doing is looking at the bigger images that help bring those words on the page to life and give them depth, so that we can best understand the Bible that we have as it is, and not just as we want it to be, because I think that's a real trap that we can fall into sometimes. All right. There's our closing thought, and a good way to kind of set up the Gospel of Matthew. Next week, we jump into the visit from the wise men. Pop quiz as we start class next time on how many wise men there were. And then we will pick up the story there as we go. Glad that you were with us this evening. Have a good one.